Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty series here on NCAA Football 14. We'll be continuing our way through the 2024 college football season, as today we'll be going through weeks 4, 5, and 6. Last episode, we went through the first 3 weeks of the year, and the way I sort of view it is the first 3 weeks are sort of the entree, and then week 4 and beyond is the 5-star gourmet meal. So a lot of teams just had their non-conference games in the last episode. The SEC and the Big Ten pretty much got right into conference play, but pretty much everybody else stayed out of conference for the most part. And there were some very surprising results throughout the country. Obviously some big in-conference games in the main conferences. Florida and Oklahoma headlining the list. Oklahoma won that game in week 3. But there haven't been a ton of drastic changes to the rankings quite yet. And I have a feeling that will change today, and that'll change quickly with multiple big-time matchups on the schedule through weeks 4, 5, and 6. So as we look at the top 10, not a whole lot of movement for the most part quite yet. And then going down the board here, a lot of new teams starting to creep their way up towards the rankings, and we have some teams falling out as well. As for the Heisman watch, Duke quarterback Justin Tucker remains on top, but the big story of the first few weeks has been the performance of Georgia quarterback Aram Kachiken, who has completely broken out onto the scene. He's had an unbelievable start to the year, and for me, he looks like the early Heisman frontrunner if he can keep this going. So as we look at the docket here for these next 3 weeks, there's a lot of big-time matchups starting right away here in week 4. Got some big games on the slate. Curious to see how Texas and Alabama play against each other. Both of those teams look pretty good to start the year. And you got some big games down the board like Indiana, Miami, and then Ohio State, Nebraska, 2 top 10 teams in the Big Ten. Week 5 is headlined by Georgia and Oklahoma. I think those might be the 2 best teams in the entire country right now. And then week 6, a lot of big matchups headlined by Michigan and Oregon, and then Duke and Miami. Let's start with week 4. We kick things off in Berkeley. Cal had an interesting episode to start the year because they lost to an FCS team to open up the season. I'm curious to see if that game is sort of a fluke or if this Cal team has legitimately regressed from last year as they face off against a tough Utah squad. This ended up being a pretty good game. Utah stood toe-to-toe with the Golden Bears really the entire matchup, but ultimately Rufus Motley and Cal were a little bit too much to stop. So Cal would end up getting the win here over Utah by the final score of 34-31. Cal is 2-0 in conference play. They've looked pretty sharp ever since their Week 2 loss to FCS Northwest. As for Utah, Trenton McLaughlin played pretty well, but he could not lead his team to the win. Oklahoma State's offense has been very impressive so far, led by senior quarterback Jorgensen Jupiter, who's gotten off to a great start here as a senior. They face off against a tough Minnesota team, looking to get their first season in the Big 12 off on a good start. But running into Jorgensen Jupiter, they could not do a whole lot to stop him. Oklahoma State would steamroll past the Golden Gophers 51-20 as the legend of Jorgen Jupiter just continues to grow. Minnesota's 0-3. I'm not too worried about them. They've played a lot of really good teams so far, but you can't allow 700 yards of offense. At least Kareem Shaheed, one of their top recruits a couple years ago, played really well. But man, Jorgensen Jupiter is a total stud. 5 all-purpose touchdowns for him. The defending champion TCU Horned Frogs face off against the Vanderbilt Commodores here. TCU looks really good to start the year. They haven't missed a beat despite losing a ton of talent, but today was a little bit different. Vanderbilt was really strong in this game. Quarterback Trey Libby made a lot of big-time throws in this matchup for the Commodores, and TCU's defense really did not look sharp. They look like a unit who lost 10 of their starters last year to the NFL, because, well, they did. TCU's offense stood toe-to-toe with Vanderbilt for most of the game, but ultimately Trey Libby and the Commodores would be a little bit too much to stop as Vanderbilt upsets the defending champion TCU Horned Frogs. A huge statement win here for Vanderbilt as they would end up winning here by the final score of 35-28. TCU drops all the way to 21 despite a really solid game from quarterback Tegan Yeager. Certainly not the reason why they lost. Trey Libby threw for 4 touchdowns. He also only completed 43% of his passes. Libby is a very inconsistent and inaccurate quarterback, but he can make a lot of big throws. Texas heads to Tuscaloosa to face off against number 14 Alabama. The Crimson Tide look good other than their close Week 1 loss to Florida. As for Texas, they're 2-0. They look pretty strong. However, I don't think Texas was ready to face off against the beast known as running back Darius Coley. Coley had himself a day on the ground for Alabama. This is a team who prides themselves on running the football, and they ran it down Texas's throats, winning this game 31-24. Good win here for Alabama. The quarterback play was a little bit inconsistent, although I think Troy Davenport really has improved from last year. But the big story here was Darius Coley. This guy's a total stud. As for Texas, Onyx St. James was not great. The defense also was not great, giving Texas their first loss of the year. Number 1, Clemson is a little bit shaky in my opinion. They've only played one game so far against an FCS opponent, and they only won that game 47-24. So this is their first game against like an actual FBS team, and things started off pretty well. Clemson completely dominated in the first half, as you would expect. It looked like this game was going to be a blowout. Number 1, Clemson was going to hang on pretty easily, but not so fast. Colorado State came out the gates storming in the second half, really giving the Clemson Tigers a run for their money here in this matchup. Colorado State would tie the game up with about 3 minutes to go at 31. This gives Clemson one more opportunity here in regulation to try to win the game. They need a big-time drive here from quarterback Cedric Chapman, and they're moving the ball down the field pretty well. Chapman is making plays with his legs. He's making pretty good throws, and Clemson now has it inside the red zone. It looks like they should be able to punch it in here with under a minute to go, and they would do just that. Matthias DeRitter would score the game-winning touchdown as number 1 Clemson survives by the skin of their chinny chin, 38-31. Cedric Chapman was decent. He had a big drive late in the game, of course, but he also turned the ball over twice. As for Colorado, their quarterback was pretty efficient. They didn't run the ball all that well, but Clemson's just kind of mid. You know who hasn't been mid this year? Stanford. They look really good. They're 3-0. They're playing some good football, but they've got a big test this week against a very talented Washington team who's arguably the best team on paper in the Pac-12. This ended up being a pretty close game for the most part, very back and forth. However, the legend of the Stanford tree would go forward. Running back Rudolph Moore had himself a great game, rushing for 3 touchdowns and over 160 yards. This last score would propel Stanford over the edge, 35-32. If you're a Washington fan, I don't think you can be too upset because quarterback Kai Suggs-Gardner had a really good performance, certainly an encouraging sign. But the legend of Stanford continues. They're 4-0. They're really developing into a good story. However, the backup quarterback, Harrison Huggins, got hurt. He'll be out for a couple of weeks, so they are now down to their 3rd stringer, Ryan Scott. Number 5, Florida State hosts the Virginia Tech Hokie Pokies in what could be a real trap game for the Seminoles. Ultimately, this ended up being one of the most exciting games of the entire season so far. Both offenses went back and forth the entire game. Jacob King had a lot of big-time throws for Florida State, but DeAndre Jones and Virginia Tech answered the billing, and this game ultimately went down to the wire. Florida State would get the ball late, down 32-30, and Jacob King would launch an absolute dart down the field for Omani Pierre-Cross for what could be the go-ahead touchdown, making it 37-32, giving Virginia Tech the ball back for one more drive and an opportunity to win the game. This is DeAndre Jones' big opportunity to show who he is as a quarterback, and he's moving the Hokies down the field pretty well so far. They're getting a nice little drive together, but they don't have a lot of time. The clock is ticking. There's about 15 seconds left, and senior running back Edgar Frazier would connect with the end zone. Virginia Tech would miss the 2-point conversion, but who really gives a damn? They upset Florida State 38-37. A big win for Virginia Tech, who climbs all the way up to number 17 in the rankings. As for FSU, they fall to 13. I'm not too worried about the Seminoles. I think Virginia Tech's a really, really strong opponent. This does give Florida State a little less margin for error, however. Number 23, Navy heads to Rutgers to face off against the struggling Scarlet Knights, who are currently 0-2, although they have played some really good teams up to this point, Navy being another one. The early storyline in this game was Navy quarterback Chuck Barton suffering a first quarter injury, leading to him being taken out of the game. The backup, Daniel Washington, would come in, and he dominated. Daniel Washington was making big-time throws all game. This is a surprise because Navy's an option offense. We've never seen their starting quarterback, Chuck Burton, throw the ball anything like this. But Daniel Washington completely carved up the Rutgers defense. Navy wins 49-17. I'm a little bit surprised they don't move up. They only stay at number 23. I get that D.R. Antoine is only one person, but man, Rutgers really misses him. He made that program go, and now that he's gone, they have lost their identity. As for Navy, Daniel Washington balled out. The midshipman also ran for over 300 yards in this game as well. Our next game here, one of our two pick'em games of the week. Number 18, Indiana, traveling to number 13, Miami, with the slight majority leaning towards the Hurricanes. Now, unfortunately for Indiana, they will be without their starting quarterback, Kennedy Newsford, who got injured last week, and he will miss the next 3 weeks with a high ankle sprain, meaning their backup, Jose Burton, will start for them at the quarterback position today. And to Burton's credit, he actually played pretty well despite having to play in the rain against a really tough Miami team. He looked good. However, the Indiana defense could not stop Scooter Young Jr. and the Hurricane offense. Miami with a big win as they will remain undefeated here, defeating the Indiana Hoosiers at home and moving themselves into the top 10. I said in the introduction episode for this season, I am very high on Miami. I feel like this is their year where they're really going to play well, and this is a big-time win. And I get it's against the backup quarterback, and I get Scooter was not perfect. He only completed 50% of his passes. In the Titans franchise prospect profile, I compared Scooter Young to pretty much Cam Newton, but with a blindfold on, and that held true today. And then for Indiana, again, Jose Burton played pretty well. I think they'll be fine with him these next couple of weeks until Newsford comes back. Tennessee heads down to Gainesville to take on number 10, Florida. The Gators are one of the most fascinating teams in the country this year, largely because of their quarterback, Ernie Capellar, who's a very polarizing player. I don't know if he's good or if he's bad or what. Well, today he was pretty damn good. Ernie Capellar had one of his best games as a Gator, making big-time throws and big-time runs throughout the entire matchup. Florida would lead this one big late here in the first half before Benjamin McKenzie would actually suffer a game-ending injury, meaning that Tennessee's going to have to go to their backup quarterback, Roddy Jolly. At this point, it's 45-21. Florida leads here early in the fourth quarter. But wow, look at that catch by Skeeter Darlington, one of the biggest plays of the year. Tennessee would march forward after that play, really giving themselves a ton of momentum as they would score 2 more touchdowns after this catch by Darlington to make it a 45-42 game, with Florida only leading by 3. But all the Gators need is a first down to win the game, and Ernie Capellar would deliver. Florida survives the late comeback bid. They beat their rival Tennessee 45-42 in a really exciting matchup. Ernie Capellar did throw 2 interceptions, but he was accurate. He made big-time throws, and he had some good runs on the ground, including the final play of the game to propel Florida to the win. Got to give some props to Tennessee. This game looked over, and they fought back until the very end, only losing by 3. Benjamin McKenzie should be back next week, although you got to give your hat off to Roddy Jolly because he really led a good comeback effort. The final game of the week is certainly the most interesting one. Number 8, Nebraska against number 4, Ohio State. The pick'em really seems to be siding with the Buckeyes here, who are the favorites. This, on paper, should be a good matchup, but it ended up being a complete blowout. On the third play of the game, Ohio State cornerback Steve Stifler would return this pick six to the house, and from there, it just got worse and worse and worse for Nebraska. The Ohio State completely dominated Nebraska in this one in all facets of the game. Offense, defense, special teams. Ohio State looked head and shoulders better as they would ultimately win this matchup by the decisive score of 42-13. Got to give your hats off here to quarterback Puma Whitlock, who looks great here through his first 3 starts with Ohio State. What a win here for the Buckeyes. One of the biggest wins of the season, really for any team. Completely blowing out a top 10 opponent. Gotta feel good if you're a Buckeye fan, as Ohio State jumps Oklahoma and moves up to number 3. Puma Whitlock was great. Mookie Davis was great. Everyone on Ohio State was great. As for Nebraska, they only dropped 4 spots to number 12, and I get they lost to a really good team, but I feel like that's still a little bit generous because Nebraska, they were bad today. We'll just leave it at that. So that will wrap up week 4 here in the 2024 season. A lot of really fun games. We saw some big-time upsets, headlined by number 5 Florida State going down. We saw Ohio State completely steamroll Nebraska. The defending champion TCU Horned Frogs lost as well, so that's 3 teams ranked in the top 9 who take L's. Looking at some of the other scores, Middle Tennessee State and Missouri both remain undefeated. Notre Dame drops 52 on Pitt. Oklahoma with a nice win over Ole Miss. They are now 3-0. Auburn beats UL Lafayette. USC with a big win, along with Mississippi State dominating South Carolina 51-21. Syracuse is ranked now with a win over Nevada. Oregon and Michigan take care of business. And then Georgia would beat the now 0-4 LSU Tigers. Looking at some of the other scores around the rest of the country, Michigan State barely beats Western Michigan. Washington State is now 0-3. Those guys look quite bad, and I get Tulsa's a good team. They won 11 games last year, but Washington State has some real concerns. They have not played well this year at all. Speaking of concerns, Georgia Tech loses to UMass. Looks like it might be another rough season for the Yellow Jackets. Going down the board even further now, Memphis is 3-0. They're off to a nice start this year. Temple with another big game. Their offense has been great. And speaking of great offense, UCLA dropped 63 on Iowa. That's a lot of points. Going down the board even further now, Arkansas would upset Kentucky in overtime. Central Michigan would defeat BYU in OT. Illinois is 3-0. And then going down even farther now, Boise State with a good win. South Alabama is playing some good football. North Carolina uses to UAB. And the Tar Heels have to play number 1 Clemson next week. So times are not fun right now in Chapel Hill. And then Houston gets their first win of the year, beating Oregon State. Good for the Cougars. And that wraps up week 4. A lot of movement in the top 25 polls with 3 top 9 teams losing. Ohio State jumps Oklahoma. Florida, Middle Tennessee State, Baylor, and Miami all move up 3 spots each. They are now in the top 10 with Nebraska, Florida State, and TCU all dropping. TCU goes down from 9 to 21. They took a big hit. Virginia Tech enters the top 25. They go all the way up to 17, while Kentucky drops out. As for the Heisman watch, Aram Kachaken is now officially in first place. Darius Coley is in second, with Tucker falling to third. Ernie Capelar goes up to 4, and Jorgensen Jupiter somehow goes lower, even though he was really good last year. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. As for your players of the week here, they end up being Jorgensen Jupiter, oddly enough, and Histan Stromboli. How can a player win Player of the Week and go down in the Heisman watch? And he won it back in week 2 as well, so he has now won 2 Offensive Player of the Weeks here. That'll bring us to week 5, and again, there's a lot of big-time games here, none more exciting than Georgia and Oklahoma, arguably the 2 best teams in the country right now, facing all against each other. Plenty of other big games as well. Florida, Kentucky, Navy, Florida State. The Seminoles got to get back on track. We'll see if they can do it. Again, Georgia, Oklahoma, the game of the day by far. And then Clemson's got a tough test with North Carolina. TCU looks to rebound. USC and Oregon should be a lot of fun. And they gave Bama Ole Miss the game of the week, which is stupid, but whatever. Let's start here at Jordan-Hare Stadium. The Auburn Tigers are playing really well so far, surprisingly enough, despite losing their star quarterback, Sidney McDonald. I thought Auburn would regress, but they look really good so far. Is it too good to be true? Well, yeah, it probably is, because South Carolina completely dominated in this game. Hats off to senior quarterback Marco Prince with a big performance here, leading South Carolina to a dominant upset victory over the Tigers, really giving South Carolina some momentum for the rest of the season as they win 45-21. Jet Jackson for Auburn was pretty mediocre, and then for South Carolina, Marco Prince played really, really well in this game, 12 for 17, 233 yards and a score. There's only one problem, though. In the 4th quarter, Prince got injured in this game. He broke his foot and will likely miss pretty much the rest of the regular season. A major blow here for South Carolina. Marco Prince was really playing well this year. They have a more than capable backup in Malachi Evans, who was supposed to be their starter next year. But now he's going to be thrusted into the lineup now with Marco Prince getting injured, really killing all the momentum South Carolina would have gotten by winning this game. Next up, number 7, Florida heads to Kentucky to face off against the Wildcats. These two teams have had some really fun battles throughout this series so far. Kentucky's coming off a loss. They got to get back on the right track, while Florida is nearly coming off a loss. Tennessee almost beat them. The legend of Ernie Capellar would continue as he had another really good performance here, albeit against a pretty bad Kentucky defense, but still, it was really good to see Ernie Capellar continuing to make a lot of big-time throws while also continuing to make plays on the ground. Kentucky hung in there, but they were not able to stop this explosive, dynamic Florida offense as the Gators win 38-28 and move all the way up to number 4. That likely hints we may see some highly ranked teams lose this week, hint, hint. Ernie Capellar one-upped himself from last week, throwing 5 touchdowns in this one. He was, again, very efficient, 75% completion percentage, so his stock seems to be up here these last couple of weeks. Let's check in on Stanford. The Cardinals are currently 4-0 so far. They're playing really, really well, and they're facing off against a struggling Washington State team who I had a lot of expectations for going into the year, but the Cougars look bad so far. They haven't won yet, although they haven't had any in-conference games, so they can absolutely right the ship. And it'll be against Stanford's third-string quarterback. Their original starter, Markel Ross, is still out for another month and a half, and the backup, Harrison Huggins, will likely miss another week or two. So junior Ryan Scott will be under center today for Stanford. The Cardinal really leaned on the ground game, and running back Rudolph Moore is quickly developing into a star. When Stanford's third-string quarterback got injured, they had to turn it to their fourth-stringer, true freshman Lee Jang Chen, and he actually played pretty well, rushing for a score as Stanford stays undefeated. They win 35-24. Ryan Scott should be back next week, which is important because he actually played really well for being a third-stringer. Rudolph Moore continues to play well. The other running back, Brandon Washington, was good too. As for Washington State, there have been a lot of growing pains with freshman quarterback Chance Matsumolo, but at least J.C. Farrell had a good performance. Cal has still not lost to an FBS opponent. They're trying to keep that streak going as they face off against the Washington Huskies, who are coming off a tough loss last week against the team we just talked about, Stanford. Rufus Motley had himself another really good performance on the ground and in the air. He's not the most efficient quarterback, but he knows how to make plays, and he made enough plays today to lead Cal to the win, 35-28. Cal is now 3-0 in conference. Clearly, their loss to FCS Northwest was a flash in the pan. They've really figured some things out since then. But unfortunately, I have some bad news for them. Right at the end of the game, with just a minute to go, Rufus Motley tore his quad, and he will be out 9 weeks. That really stings, and although he hasn't been the most efficient as a passer, again, he is dynamic. He is the leader of the offense. So Cal kind of has a question here. Who do they go with at quarterback? They've got junior Marquise Harris or sophomore Brady Aarons. With Aarons being more mobile, I think he's a much better fit for the offense, and I think they should go with him. But since Rufus Motley got hurt right at the end of the game, we're not really going to know until next week because Cal never really had an opportunity to put another guy in the game. Cal's really playing well. They're 3-0 in conference, but that injury really, really stings, and I'm curious to see how they rebound with a backup quarterback likely for the rest of the year, especially if they choose a guy like Marquise Harris, who really is not the most mobile, which is very important if you want to play quarterback in their offensive system. Number 6, Michigan appears to have an easy win here at the Big House against Pitt, who is currently 0-3, really struggling in their first year in the Big Ten. However, I think Michigan really undervalued these guys. They're still a really talented squad, and Michigan might have been looking too much ahead into their matchup against Oregon next week. Pitt took total advantage of this. The Panthers set the tone in the first quarter, and they did not look back. They controlled the entire game, upsetting Michigan 33-21 in one of the most shocking upsets of the season so far. Michigan quarterback Callaghan October threw for 3 touchdowns, but he was inefficient. Running back Casey Aceron suffered a minor knee injury. He won't be out long, but he will not play next week against Oregon. A big loss for the Michigan offense, who falls all the way to number 19. The next game on the schedule we've got here is a big ACC battle between number 23 Navy. Their quarterback, Chuck Burton, is back, and he will start today, despite Daniel Washington playing great last week. They're facing off against Florida State, coming off a heartbreaking loss last week against Virginia Tech. The Seminoles are looking to right the ship, and they would certainly do that today. Florida State really played well early in this game, and they did not look back with a big win here over the Navy midshipmen. Good win here for Florida State. They had to rebound after the loss last week, and they did just that. The offense played well. The defense was a lot better. They stay at number 13. I thought they should have moved up. They beat a good Navy squad by 3 scores. Even if they only go up 1 or 2 spots, I feel like you got to give them a little bit more respect than that. Jacob King and Jayshawn Tate both played well. Romani Pierre-Cross had a big game, and as for Navy, Chuck Burton wasn't horrible, but he wasn't great. Alrighty, let's get to the moment you've all been waiting for. Number 2, Georgia against number 4, Oklahoma. I think these might be the 2 best teams in college football. The pick'em was literally 50-50, and I get it. I think these 2 teams are absolutely spectacular. I am expecting a crazy game today. Georgia came out the gates firing. On the second play of the game, Monte Grant would get this ridiculous touchdown catch to put Georgia ahead early. And through the first half, the Bulldogs certainly looked like the better team. Aram Kachakan at quarterback was absolutely dominating. Oklahoma did a good job of staying afloat, cutting into that lead in the second half. Romeo Coloci had another really good game at quarterback. But ultimately, Oklahoma's defense just could not stop Aram Kachakan. This game looks like his Heisman moment. Outperforming arguably the best quarterback in the country, Romeo Coloci, leading Georgia to the win on the road, 49-33. Big time win for the Georgia program. They're now 5-0. They move up to number 1, jumping Clemson. Romeo Coloci played well. He is certainly not at fault for the loss. He did not allow 49 points to Georgia. But man, Aram Kachakan is a stud. His draft stock is continuing to rise. I've got to assume he'll still be in first place for the Heisman watch after this dominant performance here today. Oklahoma drops to number 8. They stay in the top 10, but they take a little bit of a nosedive. Top-ranked Clemson heads to Chapel Hill to face off against the North Carolina Tar Heels. I was very high on North Carolina going into the year. So far, they've been pretty bad, and today they looked, well, pretty bad. Clemson had by far their best performance of the year. Quarterback Cedric Chapman had his best start yet. He was solid as a passer, but what really impressed me was his ability on the ground, making dynamic plays with his legs. Clemson would win this game big over UNC, taking it home 47-21. Clemson does drop to number 2, but that's only because Georgia had such a big win. So it's not really Clemson not playing well, it's just that Georgia looks awesome. As for UNC, they're 0-3. I thought they should have been ranked going into the year, but I think I was completely wrong about these guys. They look overrated. They just don't look all that good. And then as for Clemson, it was not a perfect game for Cedric Chapman. He completed under 50% of his passes, but he made a few big throws, and then on the ground, he was a monster with 370 all-purpose yards and 4 total touchdowns. I want to take a look at South Alabama. The Jaguars look really good so far this year. Obviously, in Season 1 of this series, they made the college football playoff and made it all the way to the national championship. Last year, they were really bad, but it feels like they've turned a corner. They do have a really tough matchup here against Southern Miss, and this ended up being a really high-scoring, close game. But ultimately, South Alabama was able to win this one 49-42. Q.J. Reddings at quarterback played really well in this game, and I think this South Alabama offense is more dynamic than the one a couple years ago that made the national championship. Obviously, this defense is nowhere close to the team who made it to the championship in year 1. They don't have guys like Cardell Simpson and Tyreek Callahan anymore on that side of the ball, but this offense was really impressive. As for Southern Miss, their quarterback, Dustin Wallace, had the most Jameis Winston-type stat line you've ever seen. 51% completion percentage, over 20 yards per completion, 4 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Southern Miss is a really good team. They won 10 games last year. So for South Alabama to win this game, even if it's only by 7, I think this is a really good win for them. And I think South Alabama might be back. Number 9, Baylor faces off against the struggling BYU Cougars, who have gotten off to a really poor start early in this season, whereas Baylor looks like they might be the team to beat in the Big 12. Quarterback Forrest Holloway has struggled so far this year, but he played really well in this matchup. You gotta feel encouraged with performances like this from your young quarterback. However, BYU actually kept this game close throughout. This late touchdown here by running back Cooper Junksley would put BYU ahead by 6 late in the game, meaning Forrest Holloway's got to make some huge throws. And how about this? A game-winning touchdown to Walton Moran in the back of the end zone as Baylor wins 25-24. I don't think I've ever been encouraged by an undefeated top 10 team beating a really bad team by 1 at home. But I feel really encouraged about this win for Baylor because Forrest Holloway played really well in this matchup, for his standards at least. So if Forrest Holloway can play like this, and they can still lean on the ground game with Dontavius Brown, I think Baylor can beat just about anybody in the entire country. Next up, we head out west to Big Ten country. God, that feels weird. As USC faces off against the Oregon Ducks. Oregon would get 83% of the pick'em vote in this one, which is a surprise to me because USC is a really good opponent. And the Trojans really stood toe-to-toe with the Ducks this entire game. Quarterback Barrett Cherokee had one of his best games as a passer in his entire career, and wide receiver Justice Everdeed had a breakout-esque performance for Oregon. However, USC's offense stood toe-to-toe with the Ducks the entire game. Scotty Kimbrell would connect with this beautiful throw to the true freshman wide receiver Tay Devine for a touchdown. Oregon would march right down the field with the score at their own. The Ducks would take a double-digit lead in the fourth quarter, but USC really pushed forward here with a strong comeback effort. Scotty Kimbrell would connect with another great touchdown pass here over to Cash Wade Jr., and then USC would get the ball late looking to win the game, and that they would do. Scotty Kimbrell was efficient in the pocket this game, making big-time throws, leading the Trojans to the upset here against Oregon, 35-30. I think this is a great win for USC. They jump up to number 12. As for the Ducks, quarterback Barrett Cherokee was phenomenal. There are a lot of questions about his ability as a passer, but he was really efficient today. He didn't turn the ball over, completed 70% of his passes while constantly making big throws. So I think Cherokee's stock is on the rise in this game despite the loss. Scotty Kimbrell II, another quarterback projected to go pretty early in this year's draft, added 4 scores of his own. So that will wrap up Week 5. A lot of really exciting games here. We've got a few upsets and multiple highly ranked teams falling. Looking at some of the other games, Central Michigan and Missouri remain undefeated. Nebraska rebounds with a big win over Tulane. Notre Dame beats Purdue. Duke drops 55 on NC State. Texas loses again. They've now lost 2 in a row. Arizona is back ranked. TCU drops 54 on SMU. It looks like the Horned Frogs are back. Middle Tennessee State finds themselves in the top 5 with a nice win over Western Kentucky. And the Miami beats Maryland by a lot, and Alabama is now ranked in the top 10 after beating Ole Miss. Looking at some of the other scores, Cincinnati loses their first game of the year. Oklahoma State allows 55 to Georgia State and wins. Jorgensen Jupiter is literally carrying that entire team. Oklahoma State's defense is bad. Virginia upsets Syracuse in overtime. Utah loses to the now undefeated 4-0 Fresno State Bulldogs. UCF humbles Vanderbilt after their big win last week. Georgia Tech gets a nice win over Louisville. Minnesota's finally on the win column as they beat Oregon State. Rutgers is now 0-4, and to make matters worse, their quarterback Kyler Kitaude broke his foot, and he is out for the year. Poor Rutgers. What a total disaster this season has been. I don't think it's all bad necessarily because Rutgers' season is pretty much over by starting 0-4. So now they get to start true freshman Saquon Saint, let him get familiar with the offense before he becomes the full-time starter next year. So maybe this isn't the worst thing in the world for Rutgers. Just view this as a rebuilding year. Try to come back next year stronger than ever. Texas A&M wins their first game of the year. Illinois is now 4-0. Indiana loses to Florida Atlantic. Maybe we should hop off the Indiana hype train. Memphis loses their first game of the year. Bad loss for Texas Tech as they lose to Northern Illinois. And then going down the board even further now, Iowa with a nice win over Michigan State, while Tennessee beats LSU. And then Boston College loses by 17 to New Mexico. Boston College is rough this year. They suck. Let's take a look at the polls after Week 5. A lot of movement, including our first change at number 1. with Georgia jumping Clemson after their big win against Oklahoma. Ohio State, Middle Tennessee State, and Baylor are also getting first place votes. Not a whole lot of undefeated teams left here. You've got that group at the top, and then going down you have teams like Virginia Tech, Duke, Missouri, and then teams on the radar of being ranked soon like Virginia and Stanford, who have not lost yet. South Carolina, Arizona, and Central Michigan are now ranked, while a few teams drop out of the poll. Michigan drops from 16 to 9, while Navy, Indiana, and Syracuse are out of the top 25 altogether. Stanford is right outside. Hopefully they get in because they kind of deserve it. I'm really enjoying seeing this Stanford story blossom, essentially. As for the Heisman Watch, obviously Aram Katchakan is still in first after his big performance. Darius Coley stays in second, and then Ernie Capellar, Jorgensen Jupiter, and Callaghan October jump up. How is Callaghan October here? He played really badly in a loss to a bad team, and he enters the top 5. He hasn't been bad this year, but how is he on the list as opposed to somebody like Justin Tucker or Romeo Colucci, who have actually been really good this year? As for your players of the week, Josh Parks for TCU recorded 3 interceptions, and on offense, it's Clemson quarterback Cedric Chapman. That'll bring us to week 6 now. This week has so many interesting games on the slate. So Auburn, who played on Saturday, has to play 2 days later against FCS West. Oklahoma, Texas, Red River rivalry. Ohio Central, Michigan should be fun. How many points will Georgia beat Tennessee by? How many points will Florida beat LSU by? Missouri, Oklahoma State. Michigan, Oregon, a rematch of the college football playoff last year. Nebraska, Penn State. And then going down even farther, Duke and Miami on the night slate. That looks like it could be a fun game. Let's start with Oklahoma and Texas, the Red River rivalry. How many points is Oklahoma going to win by today? The Sooners are pissed off, coming off a loss, and they're now playing against their rival Texas. The Longhorns have not played well their last couple of games. Well, Romeo Colucci had himself another big-time performance as he is continuing to look like the best quarterback in this year's upcoming draft. His stock continues to go up, and he very well might be the number 1 overall pick at this point when it's all said and done. Texas kept this game competitive and interesting, but Oklahoma was able to avoid the upset bid 42-31. After the last episode, it looked like Texas was back, but today they went 0-3. What happened? As for Oklahoma, Romeo Colucci had another great game. I have no clue how he's not on the Heisman Watch. That's just blasphemous to me. Next up, we take a look at Ohio State, who's coming off a big win a couple weeks ago against Nebraska. They face off against Iowa here on the road. This is always a tough place to play, and Ohio State was certainly feeling the elements of this loud fan base early in this game because the Iowa Hawkeyes played really well in this matchup. Iowa was in clear control throughout really the entire game. Running back Choo Choo ran over the Ohio State defense today, and Iowa led comfortably going into the fourth quarter. But then it's like a new beast awakened. Puma Whitlock, the Ohio State quarterback, turned it up a notch, and Ohio State's offense looked like the 1972 Dolphins in the fourth quarter. They stormed back in this one and were able to survive the upset bid against Iowa. This late touchdown by Mookie Davis would be the icing on the cake as Ohio State survives 49-41 in what ended up being a really exciting matchup. Nice win for Ohio State. They didn't play all that well early, but I think Iowa's a really tough team, and you got to give the Buckeyes a lot of credit. They really played well down the stretch. Puma Whitlock is a total monster. There's a reason why Ohio State was my preseason pick to win the national championship. I think they have upgraded at quarterback, and their entire offensive skill position group from last year is here and getting better with this new quarterback. Let's take a look at the newly ranked number 1 Georgia Bulldogs coming off a big win last week against Oklahoma, facing off against their rivals, the Tennessee Volunteers. I think Tennessee has played pretty well this year. Overall, they've performed on a high level, but they've got a really tough matchup this week against Georgia. In the first half, Tennessee actually kept this game really competitive. Their offense was good, their defense was solid as well, but as the third quarter went around, it really felt like Georgia was starting to pull away. Aram Katchakan had another great performance as he still looks like the runaway favorite for the Heisman Trophy right now. And Georgia really built a big enough lead to where it looked like the upset was not going to happen, especially considering all the momentum they had. This pick six by Gabriel Fanatelli late in the third quarter put Georgia up big. But after that play, Tennessee really figured some things out. Tennessee almost came back down by 4 scores a couple weeks ago against Florida. They were able to have another miraculous comeback today, but the only difference compared to the Florida game, they actually finished the job. This touchdown by Skeeter Darlington would be enough for Tennessee to win the game 45-38 as number 1 Georgia goes down in defeat. Tennessee is now ranked. I really like this Tennessee team. They fought back through adversity. They deserve to be in the top 25. And then as for Georgia, Aaron Katchinken was great. Still the runaway favorite for the Heisman, as he should be. Speaking of guys who should be Heisman favorites, Jorgensen Jupiter for Oklahoma State has been fantastic. But they've got a really tough game here against a very strong Missouri team who quietly is playing really good football to start the year. Jorgensen Jupiter had, unsurprisingly, another really good game, and Oklahoma State's defense had, unsurprisingly, another really bad game. This time, the Oklahoma State defense did too much damage to where their offense could not do enough to win, as Missouri would take it home 40-35 with this late touchdown pass from M.J. Combs into the hands of Zacchaeus Bolton. Nice win for Missouri, who is now ranked at number 11. Could the Tigers be the team to beat in the Big 12, with Oklahoma being bad on defense and TCU looking a little bit shaky here early in the season? Speaking of TCU, we'll take a look at them next as they head to Corvallis to face off against one of their new Big 12 foes, the Oregon State Beavers. TCU has not gotten off to the start they had hoped for this year, although they have scored more than 50 points twice. Their offense does look really good. And, well, today, TCU's offense looked again really good, and their defense looked again really bad. Being down by 7 late in the fourth quarter, they needed a game-tying drive, and Tegan Yeager was able to do that, bringing this game into overtime. TCU got the ball first. They were only able to kick a field goal, so they're up by 3, meaning Oregon State can win with a touchdown, and they would do just that. Brad Mangum, the backup running back, would be the one to score it as Oregon State upsets the defending champions 40-37, and TCU is now unranked. I feel like that's a little bit disrespectful. I think TCU still belongs in the top 25, but yeah, their defense is just not very good. And even Tegan Yeager looked a little bit shaky in this game, probably his worst performance of the season. One of my favorite games on the slate here is Michigan and Oregon for a couple of reasons. This is a college football playoff rematch from last year. Both of these teams are very evenly matched. The pick'em is super close. And both of these teams just lost last week, so they both need a win. This game was pretty low scoring early. It was only 21-14 going into the fourth quarter in favor of Michigan. But once we got to the fourth quarter, both offenses really figured some things out. They were really moving the ball down the field a lot better. This late touchdown from the Wolverines would ultimately bring this game to overtime. So we've got another OT battle on our hands. Oregon would get the ball first, and they would strike with an early touchdown pass from Barrett Cherokee to the tight end, Zarif Murawziri. Michigan would get it back, and they would respond with a score of their own as Creed Raven would catch the game-tying touchdown, bringing us into a double overtime. On a 4th and goal, Michigan decided to try to punch it in with a touchdown, and that decision backfired as Callaghan October would be sacked. And they would do just that on this incredible touchdown run by Mason Tardle to win the game. But there's one more thing. Oregon decided to go for 2, for whatever reason. I think it's because these teams are now becoming rivals and they don't like each other, as Oregon ended up converting the 2-point conversion to win 50-42. I don't know why they went for 2 or felt the need to do so. I get these teams don't really like each other, but I don't know why Oregon would have that animosity towards Michigan. Oregon beat the Wolverines twice last year, and they beat them again here. So wouldn't Michigan be the team who's pissed off? The Wolverines entered today's episode ranked number 7, but with 2 consecutive losses, they are now out of the top 25 altogether. Tough times in Michigan. They've got to figure some things out. Number 11, Nebraska heads to Happy Valley to face off against 21 Penn State. This is a really big opportunity for both of these teams to show what they're made of. They've both lost early games this year, looking to rebound, and both quarterbacks played pretty well. Marquez Shakir for Nebraska had another very solid game, making big-time plays, but Nebraska's defense could not handle Lyndon Kirkstead for Penn State, who threw for 5 touchdowns in this game, 3 of which were caught by his new number 1 wide receiver, Ark Rain, leading Penn State to the big win over Nebraska. Rough episode here for the Cornhuskers, losing to both Ohio State and Penn State. Both games on the road. Both teams are really good, so on one hand, I get it. But Nebraska's got to be able to win these games. And again, I feel like they should have dropped a little bit farther. I think 17 is a little bit generous. As for Penn State, they move up to 16 with the big win here. We'll see if Penn State can keep it going. They obviously have a pretty rigorous schedule coming up with teams like Ohio State and Michigan. Stanford is 5-0. They're playing some great football here, but they're down to their third-string quarterback. We'll see how they can do against a really talented Hawaii squad. Stanford's offense played really well here. The offense is an old-school physical team. Again, they love to run the ball. Rudolph Moore is the engine of this team. Hawaii's quarterback got hurt, so they had to go to their second stringer, and he played really well, leading them on a game-time touchdown to bring it into overtime. Hawaii got the ball first, kicked a field goal, and now it was up to Stanford to try to win the game here with a touchdown as the tight end Wesley Marston would break tackles like a maniac on this play, scoring his fourth touchdown of the game, leading Stanford to a win 44-41. Stanford is now finally ranked. They're 6-0. Are the Stanford Cardinals a legitimate contender to make it out of the Pac-12 into the college football playoff and make a run for the national championship? And I believe the answer is yes. This team has a lot of similarities to last year's TCU team. Adversity at the quarterback position, talented offensive skill position players, and a very well-rounded and experienced defense. Number 23, South Carolina is now down to a backup quarterback for the rest of the year with Marco Prince's injury. They'll face off against the Kentucky team who has lost 2 straight, trying to get back on the win column. South Carolina's coming off a huge win last week despite the Marco Prince injury, and it seems like they're rallying behind their star quarterback going down. The backup, Malachi Evans, looked just fine out there. He played really solidly, leading South Carolina to a nice win over Kentucky. Final score of 45-16, a total blowout. South Carolina really didn't move up at all in the rankings. I think they should have. I think not pushing them up is kind of disrespectful, if we're being honest. As for Kentucky, they went 3-0 in the last episode and 0-3 today. The issue with Kentucky is just like last year, their defense is as soft as a teddy bear, which is a surprise because their defense is actually really talented, but for whatever reason, they just suck. Last week, number 6 Baylor beat winless BYU by 1 point at home with a late game-winning drive, but I still felt encouraged by that win. I think I might have been blinded by the Baylor hype to avoid all the red flags I just said in that statement, and all of those red flags came out today. Baylor got steamrolled by Vanderbilt, losing 34-9. Vanderbilt has now beaten TCU and Baylor today, the latter of whom in dominant fashion, as the Commodores are now ranked at 25. And as for Baylor, I thought they looked like the best team in the Big 12. I might be wrong, and I think with Baylor and TCU struggling, Missouri might be the team to beat in this conference. The Big 12 has been really fascinating this year, and with Vanderbilt playing well, maybe they could be a team at the top of the conference when it's all said and done. One of the games I was most excited about going into today's episode was Duke and Miami. I want to see if Miami is for real against a great opponent like Duke, who despite being the underdog, seems to be the consensus pick'em choice, getting 2/3 of the vote. I thought this game was going to be really close. It was not. This game was a complete blowout. At halftime, Miami led 42-3. Let me say that again. At halftime, Miami led 42-3. Duke made the score look closer in the second half, but this was complete domination. I told you guys in the very first episode of this season, Miami is legit, and boy did they prove me right today, winning 56-24. The Hurricanes are now ranked number 3 in the top 25. Scooty Young had the best game of his career. He made big-time throws per usual, but he was super efficient. If Scooty Young can be consistently efficient, then I think Miami can beat anyone in college football. As for Duke, Justin Tucker was not great today. The Blue Devils only dropped down 3 spots. I think they should have gone down a little bit farther. Duke played horribly today. The final game of the episode will be down in Cal, Berkeley, as Cal faces off against their former in-conference rivals, UCLA. Now they're just their rivals. Cal obviously has the quarterback storyline with Rufus Motley hurt. They decided to start the junior, Marquise Harris, which I think is a bad decision because he's not really a great fit for the offense, but he proved me wrong today, throwing for 4 touchdowns. UCLA's offense was very strong as well. This late touchdown by quarterback Jayshawn Tatum would bring the game into overtime. We've had a lot of overtime games today. UCLA would get the ball first. Their field goal try, however, would be no good. So all Cal needs to do is score a touchdown, and they would do just that with the backup running back Tim Howard finding the end zone as Cal improves to 4-1. They beat UCLA 44-38. Good win for Cal, who still has not lost to an FBS team. I still think they'll be able to compete for the Pac-12 without their starting quarterback. Now, I don't know if they're going to be better than a team like, say, Stanford, and they still have to worry about teams like Arizona and Washington, who are still really good. But Cal is, I think, just going to be fine. Their defense is really strong. Their offensive playmakers have really stepped up. So it's just going to be a matter of Marquise Harris playing consistent football here down the stretch in this season. So that will wrap up Week 6 as we take a look at the results. Despite getting 2 days of rest, Auburn blows out FCS West 28-3. Central Michigan with a nice win over a good Ohio team, and the Chippewas jump up 7 spots. Clemson moves back to number 1 with a nice win. Mississippi State is now 4-1. LSU is 0-5. Middle Tennessee State with a good win. Virginia is now ranked. Florida State with a close win over Maryland, and USC drops 44 on Northwestern. Looking at some of the other scores, Cincinnati gets a nice win over Minnesota. Navy drops 52 on Air Force. Dear Lord. Washington with a nice win over Virginia Tech. The Hokies drop right back out of the top 25. Tulsa with a good win. Southern Miss with a good win. Pitt wins another game. They blow out the now 0-5 Purdue Boilermakers. I was very wrong going into the year about Purdue. I thought they were going to be good. North Carolina finally wins. Texas A&M loses. Indiana gets back on the win column. Houston wins again against a tough Georgia State team. Then moving even farther, Michigan State with a nice win. Washington State is now 0-5 as they lose to Colorado. USF with a nice win over Texas Tech. UCF gets upset. Rutgers beats Boston College. I get Boston College stinks, but hey, a win's a win for Rutgers. It's about the small victories for them. So as we look at the AP poll, Clemson moves right back up to number 1 with Georgia losing. Miami is the biggest mover, going up to 3, jumping Middle Tennessee State and Florida. Missouri jumps up 7 spots all the way to 11. Georgia and Baylor both take big hits. Central Michigan with a big leap, while Stanford, Tennessee, Virginia, and Vanderbilt are all ranked for the first time this season, with 4 teams dropping out, those being Virginia Tech, Michigan, TCU, and Arizona. As we take a look at the Heisman watch, there is a little bit of movement. Not too much at the top, though, with Aaron Ketchikan still very firmly in first place. Ernie Capellar now in second. He passes Darius Coley. Callaghan October jumps up again, even though his team lost again. At least he played well, I guess. And then Mookie Davis of Ohio State is now in 5th. Players of the week on offense, it's Puma Whitlock for Ohio State. I think he deserves to be in the Heisman race more than October, although I think you can say that about a lot of quarterbacks being more deserving. And then Riley Fuller of Rice wins it on defense. Let's take a look at the schedules here for week 7, 8, and 9. I think we really have learned about a lot of teams this episode. We're really starting to see which top dogs are legit, which teams are frauds, and which underdogs really look good. Here in Week 7, we've got some big games. Notre Dame and Nebraska should be a lot of fun. The Fighting Irish quietly played quite well in this episode. Florida and Vanderbilt, Baylor and Missouri. I'm really curious to see if Stanford can keep this going. Got some big games in the ACC with Clemson and Navy, and then Florida State and Miami. I'm curious to see if Miami can keep this going. They look really, really good. And then in Week 8, got some more fun matchups here. Indiana, Penn State could be a fun game. And then going down even further, Virginia, Ohio State. That could be a tough game for the Buckeyes. Iowa, Oregon, Stanford, Notre Dame. Big-time rivals. That should be a lot of fun. And then in Week 9, Florida and Georgia. That's going to be a huge game. The winner of that game has the inside track of winning the SEC East. Ohio State, Penn State, Auburn, Oklahoma, Nebraska, USC, Army, Baylor, Stanford, Fresno State, Bama, Tennessee. There's some really fun games in the next episode that I'm going to be really excited to cover. So that'll wrap up the episode. Hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.